Complete silence descended upon the Kensington dining room the moment the Duke of Westmoreland arrived, entirely uninvited. Rumoured to have ruined 3 noble families before breakfast, he glared at the room's occupants as if they were dirt right up until Adelaide Kensington opened her mouth and signed her own death warrant. The autumn of 1876 was notoriously unforgiving in Berkshire. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of Highfield Manor, the Kensingtons' ancestral home, as if trying to wash away the desperate facade the family had meticulously constructed. A decade ago, the Kensington name commanded respect across the south of England. Now, thanks to Lord Richard's disastrous investments in the East India Company and his older son Thomas's insatiable appetite for the baccarat tables in Mayfair, the family was teetering on the edge of total, irreversible ruin. But tonight one wouldn't know it. Lady Clara, Adelaide's stepmother, had spent their last remaining line of credit with the local butchers and florists to stage a dinner party of desperate opulence. The silver had been polished until it gleamed like mirrors, and the dining table groaned under the weight of roasted pheasant, truffled potatoes, and claret they absolutely could not afford. The guest of honour was Lord Harrington, an aging, fabulously wealthy Viscount looking for a young, pliable bride. Clara was determined to serve up her younger stepdaughter, Penelope, on a silver platter. Penelope was terrified. Lord Richard was sweating through his heavily starched collar, and Adelaide Kensington, 23 and widely considered past her prime and far too opinionated, was simply trying to survive the evening without stabbing anyone with a dessert fork. They had just sat down to the first course, a rather watery leek soup, when the heavy oak front doors of the manor slammed open with a concussive boom that rattled the crystal chandeliers. The dining room fell into a terrified hush. Lord Richard half rose from his chair, his napkin falling to the floor. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Heavy, unhurried footsteps echoed on the marble floors of the foyer. Their elderly butler, Higgins, was practically shoved aside as the dining-room doors were thrown open. There stood Arlo Remington, the Duke of Westmoreland. He was a man who needed no introduction, though his reputation preceded him like a dark, suffocating thundercloud. At 32, he was devastatingly wealthy, entirely ruthless, and notoriously cruel to those who crossed him. He was the man who had supposedly driven Lord Astor's cousin to flee the country over a gambling dispute, and who owned half the railways in the north. He was dripping wet, his heavy black riding cloak pooling rainwater onto Clara's prized Persian rug. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his piercing pale blue eyes swept the room with absolute disdain. Lord Kensington, the Duke drawled, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a shiver down Adelaide's spine. "I do hope I am not interrupting." He did not sound hopeful in the slightest. He sounded like a predator who had just cornered a wounded rabbit. Your Grace," Lord Richard stammered, his face draining of all colour. We were not expecting you." "Clearly," the Duke sneered, stepping fully into the room and stripping off his wet leather gloves finger by finger. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pulled up an empty chair, the one meant for the vicar who had wisely claimed illness, and sat down directly across from Adelaide. "I found myself in the area, and since your son Thomas has been rather elusive regarding my recent correspondence, I thought a personal visit was in order." A collective intake of breath swept the table. Lord Harrington shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the scent of scandal. Thomas, sitting at the far end of the table, looked as though he might vomit directly into his soup. The Duke leaned back, waving away a terrified maid who approached with a wine-glass. "Do continue," he commanded the table. "Pretend I am not here." But that was impossible. He dominated the space. Over the next excruciating 20 minutes, Arlo Remington made a sport of humiliating the family. When Clara nervously offered him a plate of pheasant, he eyed it as if it were roadkill. "I prefer my meat without the distinct flavor of desperation, Lady Kensington," he remarked coldly. When Lord Harrington attempted to make polite conversation about the weather, The Duke cut him off. "I do not care for small talk, Harrington. Nor do I care for the fact that you are currently drooling over a girl young enough to be your granddaughter," he said, gesturing lazily toward a mortified Penelope. The table was paralyzed. Lord Richard just stared at his plate, absolutely broken. Thomas was shaking. Clara was silently weeping. The Duke was systematically stripping the family of their dignity, piece by piece, and enjoying it. He finally turned his icy gaze to Adelaide's father. "Let us dispense with the theatre, Richard. We both know why I am here. Your family is bankrupt. Your son is a thief. I am here to collect what is mine. And I assure you, by the time I am finished, you will not even have the rags on your back to sleep in." He smiled, a cruel, shark-like stretching of the lips. Such a pity, a pathetic end to a pathetic family. Something inside Adelaide snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a lifetime of watching her father crumble, of watching entitled men use their wealth as a weapon, boiling over in a single second. She slowly placed her silver spoon down on the table. The sharp clink echoed like a gunshot. "Is it the title that gives you the right to abandon basic human decency, Your Grace?" Her voice rang out, shockingly steady. "Or were you simply raised in a barn with a particularly haughty breed of swine?" The room stopped breathing. Adelaide saw Thomas close his eyes in absolute horror. Her father choked on his own saliva. Arlo Remington's head snapped toward her. His pale blue eyes locked onto hers, narrowing dangerously. "I beg your pardon," he whispered, the quietness of his voice far more terrifying than a shout. "I asked," Adelaide said, leaning forward slightly, refusing to break eye contact, "if you are naturally this utterly devoid of manners, or if you had to hire a tutor to teach you how to be so exquisitely boorish. You burst into our home, ruin our carpet, insult my stepmother's hospitality, and attempt to intimidate my father at his own dinner table. If you have business, handle it in the daylight like a gentleman, though I suppose expecting gentleman's behavior from a man whose reputation belongs in the gutter is a fool's errand." Lord Harrington actually whimpered. The Duke stared at her. The silence stretched until it felt to Adelaide like the walls were closing in. She could hear her own heartbeat roaring in her ears. She knew who he was. She knew he could destroy them with a snap of his fingers. But she refused to look away. Slowly, the dangerous predatory glare in his eyes melted into something else. Something that looked horrifyingly like amusement. "And you are?" he asked, his voice low. "Adelaide," she said coldly, "the daughter who is utterly unimpressed by you." The Duke stood up slowly. He didn't look at Lord Richard. He didn't look at Thomas. He kept his eyes entirely on Adelaide. "Adelaide," he repeated, rolling her name around in his mouth, as if tasting a strange new wine. He turned to her father. "Kensington, my carriage is outside. I want your daughter in my library at Westmoreland Estate at precisely 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. If she is late by a single minute, I will have the constables arrest your son for forgery by noon." Without another word, he turned on his heel, his dark cloak billowing behind him, and strode out of the dining room. The moment the front door clicked shut, absolute chaos erupted. Lady Clara collapsed into a genuine dead faint, her head narrowly missing the soup tureen. Lord Richard buried his face in his trembling hands, sobbing openly, while Lord Harrington stood up, declared that he could not associate with a family facing criminal charges, and scurried out the door like a frightened rat. Adelaide rounded on her brother. "Thomas, what did you do?" Thomas was pale, his eyes wide with a terror she had never seen before. I needed money to pay off Lord Cavendish. He was going to break my legs, Bay, so I signed a promissory note to Westmoreland's bank." "You forged father's signature," she demanded, feeling the blood drain from her face. "Worse," her father whispered from his chair, looking up with hollow, defeated eyes. "He forged Westmoreland's signature to clear a massive line of credit. £50,000. Adelaide's knees nearly gave out. £50,000. It was an astronomical sum, a sum that could buy a dozen estates like theirs. It was a hanging offence, or at the very least a lifetime in a debtor's prison. "Why does he want me?" she asked, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "Why did he summon me to his estate? I have nothing to do with this." "Because you insulted him," Thomas cried out, running his hands through his hair. "He's a sadist, Bear. He's going to torture you to punish us. He's going to make you beg." Adelaide didn't sleep that night. She sat by her bedroom window watching the rain continue to assault the glass, her mind racing through every horrific possibility. Arlo Remington was not a man who forgave. He was a man who exacted vengeance with meticulous, surgical precision. By 8 in the morning the rain had stopped, leaving the world cold and grey. Adelaide, dressed in her best day gown, a modest, high-collared navy blue dress, refusing to look like a beggar, even if she was one. She ordered her father's carriage, ignoring his desperate pleas for her to run away to their aunt in France. Running would only doom them faster. The Westmoreland estate was located just across the county line. It was less of a house and more of a fortress, a sprawling, imposing structure of dark stone and Gothic spires. As her carriage pulled up the gravel drive, Adelaide felt like a prisoner being delivered to the executioner. A stiff, silent butler escorted her through impossibly grand hallways lined with priceless tapestries and armor, finally opening a set of heavy mahogany doors. "Miss Adelaide Kensington, Your Grace," the butler announced, before stepping out and closing the doors with a heavy, final thud. The library was massive, smelling of old paper, leather, and wood smoke. Arlo Remington was standing by a roaring fireplace, nursing a glass of amber liquid. In the daylight he was even more intimidating. He was not in his riding gear today, but a sharply tailored charcoal suit that emphasized the broadness of his shoulders. He didn't turn around immediately. He let her stand there, letting the silence work its psychological weight. Adelaide refused to fidget. Finally he turned. "You are exactly 2 minutes early, Miss Adelaide. I am terribly disappointed. I had the constables on standby. I would hate to ruin your morning's schedule of destroying families, Your Grace," Adelaide replied, keeping her chin high. He let out a low chuckle, walking over to a massive oak desk. He picked up a leather-bound folder and tossed it onto the center of the desk. "Your brother's handiwork. Quite clumsy, really. The loops on my W are much more aggressive. What do you want, Your Grace?" she asked, cutting to the chase. "We do not have the money. If you send Thomas to prison, you will still not have the money. If you seize our estate, it will cover barely a fraction of a £50,000 debt. So, what is the purpose of this game?" He stopped, tilting his head as he assessed her. The amusement faded from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating sharpness. "You are surprisingly pragmatic for a woman whose family is facing total annihilation," he noted. "Panic solves nothing. Now what is the price?" Arlo walked slowly around the desk, stopping just a few feet in front of her. He was so tall she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I have a problem, Adelaide," he said softly. "A rather large, irritating problem. My father passed away 3 months ago. In his infinite, twisted wisdom, he left a stipulation in his will. The entirety of his unentailed wealth, the cash, the foreign investments, the railway shares, which amounts to roughly £4 million, is held in a trust. I cannot access it until I am married." Adelaide blinked. "You? Married?" "I pity the poor woman." His jaw tightened. "Keep your sharp tongue behind your teeth for just 1 moment and listen. My uncle, Lord Charles Remington, is the executor of the trust. He is a greedy, scheming viper who is actively trying to prove me unfit to inherit so he can claim the fortune for himself. To secure the money, I must marry immediately, but I cannot marry one of the simpering, brainless debutantes of the ton. They would be eaten alive by my family's politics within a week. I need a wife who cannot be bullied, A wife who does not flinch when an aristocrat raises his voice. A wife who is bold enough to insult a duke at her own dinner table. Adelaide's breath hitched. The room suddenly felt very small. You cannot be serious. I am perfectly serious, he said, stepping closer. Here is my proposition, Adelaide. You will marry me. We will tolerate each other's existence in public, and you will manage my chaotic household and fend off my uncle's social attacks. In private, you may live your life however you please, provided you do not cause a scandal. And if I refuse... Arlo reached onto the desk, his fingers tapping the leather folder. If you refuse, I send this to Scotland Yard. Thomas hangs. Your father is ruined. Your sister ends up working in a factory or worse. Your family name turns to ash. He picked up a pen and held it out to her. Marry me, Adelaide. Sign the marriage contract, and I will burn your brother's forged note in that fireplace right now. Your family's debt will be forgiven. I will even provide your sister with a dowry so she isn't forced to marry that repulsive Lord Harrington. Adelaide stared at the pen in his hand. It felt like she was staring at a loaded pistol. Why me? She whispered, her voice finally betraying her fear. There are 100 destitute noblewomen who would jump at the chance to be a duchess, even to a devil like you. Arlo leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Because, Adelaide, last night when you looked me in the eye and called me a swine, it was the first time in 10 years anyone has told me the absolute truth. I don't need a sycophant. I need a partner who will fight back. He pressed a pen into her palm. Now, do we have a deal? Or do I call the constables? Adelaide's hand did not shake. It was a terrifying realization, but as she pressed the heavy gold nib of the pen to the thick parchment, her fingers were entirely steady. She signed her name, Adelaide Kensington, for what would be the very last time. The moment the ink dried, Arlo snatched the leather folder. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the roaring fireplace and tossed Thomas's forged promissory note directly into the flames. Adelaide watched the edges curl, turn brown, and erupt into a bright orange blaze. In 3 seconds, the evidence that would have sent her brother to the gallows was reduced to grey ash drifting up the chimney. It is done, Arlo said, turning back to her. His face was an unreadable mask of aristocratic stone. My solicitor will arrive at Highfield Manor this afternoon with the funds to settle your father's immediate debts and a draft for Penelope's dowry. We marry on Friday at St. George's by special license. Bring nothing but yourself. I will have a wardrobe prepared for you. Adelaide felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in the back of her throat, but she forced it down. How exceedingly romantic, Your Grace. We are not writing poetry, Adelaide. We are going to war, he replied flatly, and I suggest you prepare yourself. The battlefield will be our wedding reception. He wasn't exaggerating. 3 days later, Adelaide stood in the cavernous, echoing nave of St. George's, wrapped in a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace that cost more than her family's entire estate. Her father gave her away with the trembling relief of a man who had just sold his soul to save his skin. Thomas couldn't even look her in the eye. Arlo was a looming presence beside her, his voice a low rumble as he recited his vows. He slicked a heavy, square-cut sapphire onto her finger, binding them together in the eyes of God and the law. But it wasn't until the reception, held in the opulent ballroom of his London townhouse, that she truly understood what she had signed up for. High society had turned out in droves, not to celebrate, but to feast on the scandal. The whispers followed Adelaide like a swarm of angry bees. Bankrupt, purchased, an act of charity, a desperate scheme. But none of the whispers compared to the venom of Arlo's uncle, Lord Charles Remington. Charles was a man who hid his malevolence behind a veneer of polished charm. He approached Adelaide while Arlo was waylaid by a group of railway investors. Charles bowed, his smile not reaching his cold reptilian eyes. Your Grace, Charles purred, testing out her new title with obvious distaste. I must confess we were all quite shocked by Arlo's sudden, charitable impulses, plucking a bride from the absolute gutters of bankruptcy. It is almost poetic in its tragedy. Adelaide felt the eyes of a dozen aristocrats locking onto them, waiting for the beggar bride to crumble. Instead, she took a slow sip of her champagne, channeling every ounce of Arlo's terrifying composure. Charity is such a subjective word, Lord Charles, Adelaide replied, her voice carrying clearly over the ambient chatter. I prefer to think of it as a strategic acquisition. Arlo required a wife capable of distinguishing a genuine gentleman from a scheming parasite. And since the Remington family tree seems rather heavily infested with the latter, he had to look outside the usual social circles. A woman behind her gasped loudly. Charles's face flashed a deep mottled purple. You have a very sharp tongue for a woman who was destitute 48 hours ago, Charles sneered, dropping the charm entirely. Do not think you have won, little girl. Arlo's wealth is still bound by the trust. And I am the executor. I will see to it that neither of you sees a single penny of my brother's fortune. You will be a duchess of nothing. Then it is a good thing I am accustomed to nothing, Adelaide smiled, stepping closer to him, so only he could hear. But I suspect you have far more to lose than I do, Charles. Men who guard fortune so aggressively usually have their hands buried deep in the till. It was a blind guess, a shot in the dark meant to rattle him. But she saw the immediate microscopic flinch in his eyes, the slight widening of his pupils, panic. Is there a problem here, uncle? No problem at all, Arlo, Charles muttered, recovering his composure with difficulty. Just welcoming your new bride to the family. Enjoy the evening. It will be your last taste of victory. As Charles slinked away, Arlo leaned down, his breath warm against Adelaide's ear. What did you say to him? I merely suggested he was embezzling from your father's trust, she whispered back. Arlo went completely rigid. He pulled back, staring at her with a mixture of absolute shock and something completely unexpected, profound, unfiltered admiration. You magnificent, terrifying creature, he murmured. You figured out in 3 minutes what my investigators have spent 3 months trying to prove. The twist in Adelaide's marriage contract was not that she was bound to a monster. It was that she was bound to a man fighting desperately to protect his legacy from being cannibalized from within. Later that night, in the privacy of his sprawling library, Arlo finally laid all his cards on the table. My uncle isn't just trying to keep the trust out of spite, Adelaide. He has been systematically siphoning off the liquid assets, hundreds of thousands of pounds into shell companies in the Americas. If I claimed the trust and ordered an audit, his crimes would be exposed. He needs to prove me unfit, have me committed, or ruin me socially so the courts grant him permanent conservatorship. And the proof? Adelaide asked, pacing the length of the Persian rug. He keeps 2 sets of ledgers, one for the official solicitors and his own private ciphered book. He never lets it out of his sight. It is currently locked in the safe at his country estate in Kent. Tomorrow night he is hosting the annual spring gala. Half of Parliament will be there, and you need a distraction, she realized, the pieces clicking into place. Arlo shook his head. No, I am the distraction. Charles will have his eyes on me the entire night. He knows I want that ledger. He will have his guards tracking my every movement. He looked at her, his blue eyes intense. But he does not fear you, Adelaide. He thinks you are just a desperate bankrupt girl I bought to fulfill a legal requirement. Adelaide stopped pacing. A dangerous thrill, one she had never felt in her quiet, oppressed life at Highfield Manor, shot through her veins. I need the combination to the safe. The night of the spring gala was a masterclass in deception. Adelaide wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, playing the part of the dutiful, quiet trophy wife, clinging to the Duke's arm. Arlo was magnificent loud, demanding, drawing every ounce of attention and pulling Charles into a heated, public debate about railway legislation in the main ballroom. Under the cover of a changing waltz, Adelaide slipped through the servants' corridor, armed with a hairpin and the safe combination Arlo's informants had procured. Charles' private study was on the second floor, guarded by a single, bored-looking footman. She didn't hesitate. She walked right up to the footman, feigning a sudden, violent, dizzy spell. As she collapsed against him, pretending to faint, he instinctively caught her. Dropping his posture, she swiftly jammed her thumb into the pressure point on the side of his neck, a dirty trick Thomas had once taught her to escape pub brawls. The footman slumps to the floor unconscious, her heart hammering against her ribs. Adelaide locked the heavy oak doors of the study behind her. She moved to the portrait of Charles' late father, swinging it aside to reveal the heavy iron safe. 31427. The dial clicked. The heavy metal door swung open. Inside, sitting innocuously beside stacks of gold bonds, was a small, black leather book. The private ledger. She grabbed it, shoving it deep into the hidden pocket of her velvet gown. Adelaide was just turning back to the door when she heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. The door swung open. Lord Charles stood there, his face contorted in a mask of absolute fury, accompanied by two massive estate guards. "Did you honestly think I wouldn't leave a secondary watch on my own study?" Charles hissed, stepping into the room and locking the door behind him. "You stupid, arrogant girl. I am going to have you thrown into the Thames, and I will tell Arlo you ran away with a lover." He lunged for her, but Adelaide didn't scream. She didn't back away. She reached into the bodice of her gown and pulled out a small silver-plated Derringer pistol, a wedding gift she had discreetly demanded from Arlo before they left London. She leveled it directly between Charles' eyes. "Take another step, Charles, and I will ruin this beautiful Persian rug with your brains," she said, her voice as cold and steady as Arlo's had been the night he ruined her family's dinner. Charles froze, his eyes bugging out at the sight of the weapon. But he smiled a greasy, confident smile. "You won't shoot. You don't have the nerve." "She absolutely has the nerve, Uncle. In fact, I highly recommend you step back, because my wife has a terrible temper." The heavy glass panes of the study's French doors suddenly shattered inward, raining glass over the carpet. Arlo stepped through from the balcony, a heavy iron cane in his hand, looking like a vengeful god of war. Before Charles's guards could even react, Arlo swung the cane, dropping both men to the floor in two brutal, efficient strikes. Arlo stepped over their groaning bodies, his pale eyes locked onto his terrified uncle. "The game is over, Charles," Arlo said softly, holding his hand out to his wife. Adelaide placed the black ledger into his palm. "Tomorrow morning, the magistrates will receive this. You will be stripped of your titles, your properties, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life breaking rocks in a penal colony." Charles dropped to his knees, all his bluster vanishing into pathetic, weeping terror. He begged. He pleaded. But Arlo simply turned his back on him, offering Adelaide his arm. "Shall we, Your Grace?" Arlo asked. "The air in here has grown incredibly foul." They walked out of the estate together, leaving the wreckage of his uncle's life behind. As they climbed into their carriage under the moonlight, the adrenaline finally faded, leaving Adelaide shaking slightly. Arlo reached across the carriage, gently taking her trembling hand in his. The cold, ruthless Duke who had burst into her family's dining room was completely gone. In his place was a man looking at her with a reverence that took her breath away. "I bought a pawn to win a chess match," Arlo whispered, raising her knuckles to his lips. "And I discovered I had married the Queen. I am at your mercy, Adelaide. Completely and utterly." She looked at the arrogant, dangerous man who had saved her family by pretending to destroy it, and she smiled. "Good. See that you remember it, Your Grace. If you loved this story of Adelaide turning the tables on her arrogant duke and taking down a corrupt family empire, hit that like button right now. Share this with a friend who loves a fierce heroine who doesn't back down. And make sure to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, twists-filled stories just like this one. See you in the next video.